All right, welcome. My name is Adam Thada. I'm the Director of Ecological Relationships at the Center at Donaldson, which is a community of ministry sponsored by the Poor Handmaids of Jesus Christ. And it's located in Marshall County, rural Marshall County, outside of Plymouth, Indiana, in north central Indiana. And I'm presenting today on a project I'll call the Thada Homestead Bloom Report 2020. So the project origins were from the coronavirus pandemic. I knew things were going to be pretty strange when I got an email one day from the Indiana Academy of Science about our upcoming meeting saying that they're monitoring the situation. And about the very next day or two, they said the meeting's completely canceled. And then within another day or two, all the directors at our organization got together and were developing an action plan for this strange new world we were living in. And so here's my office for a lot of March and April of last year in the garage. And we entered lockdown then within 2 weeks. And I was finally able to do this project that I'd had in my mind. I had removed all the excuses I had for it. The project I'm calling the Bloom Report Project. The reasons for this project that I did, one was to document the phenology, which is the study of cyclic and seasonal natural phenomena, especially in relation to climate and plant and animal life. The second reason is to anticipate the unexpected. We need to be doing science and scientific observations, what they call basic science, for its own purpose, because creation is here, it's beautiful, it's good, it's mysterious, and we can benefit from these things even without a clear objective or as secondary benefits from these projects. And third was to give some metrics and quantify the biodiversity in this human habitation that's pretty mundane, pretty normal for the United States, for the Midwest, a half-acre suburban homestead, if you will. And some of the metrics I collected were the number of blooming species each week, whether these species were wild species or they were cultivated by humans, or whether they were native to this continent or were a result of importation from the results of European colonization. Another reason why we do stuff like this is because we can, and we need to write these observations down, and we do not know the extent to which they may be eventually useful to other people. For example, Thoreau's observations at Walden Pond, though he had no idea of climate change or the carbon cycle too much, or at least to the extent that we do today, his observations, because they were recorded and documented and faithfully passed down, are now used in actual scientific populations in ecology to document the impacts of climate change. So the methods for this project were to make weekly observations. I chose Sunday. I didn't consider this work. I don't consider it, I guess, a labor to simply, I didn't do all the data crunching on Sunday, but I would just walk around my yard and count all the flowers. Not count the actual flowers, just make observations. And I listed all the flowering forb species that were present within my property. And this was a presence or absence only. It was either check yes or no. The number of flowers or plants were irrelevant to whether it was yes or no. It could have been a single flower or it could have been many. And unfortunately, because I was usually taking photographs of the very first flower, I only have some really good photos of the flowers of some of the species, because often the first flower would be coming out, would count, and I would take a picture of it. But it wasn't, from a photogenic perspective, the best framing or the best flower for that species. Nonetheless, I would upload each new species to an app called Inaturalist, and I'll explain that in just a moment. So here's an aerial photography of the study site of my home. It is just under half an acre. It's a suburban lot that was converted from a farm field about 50 years ago. I have a good amount of just mowed grass. I have a vegetable garden, some landscaping, and then along the back, there's a power line that runs back there, and I did a native plant, native prairie seeding back there. So nothing really too out of the normal other than some intentional plantings. So here's how I kept my data on an Excel sheet. You can see the categories across the top on the x-axis and the dates, and along the y-axis are the species as I would see them. So starting over here at March 15th, I started with 5 species there: the common name, the scientific name, whether it was cultivated or not, and whether its origin was native or alien to the continent. The following week I would do the same thing, and as you can see, there was I could find a dandelion on March 15th, but I could not find one on the 24th, and there's an asterisk by the 24th because I believe I was not able to get to it on a Sunday, so I had to flex a day or two on that observation. And then you can see at March 29th that I start picking up the daffodils, chickweed, and some other weeds that were starting to bloom at that time of year. And at the bottom, if you would scroll down, you would see a summation from each of these weeks' observations. So the metrics that include total species for March 15th, 5 total species. All 5 of them were new that week. The following week, I only had 4 species. Cumulatively, still only had 5 total species on my list. None new, and 1 disappeared. The following week, on March 29th, I had 4 new species to add to my 4 from last week, so I have a total of 8. Cumulatively, I have seen 9 species, and none of them disappeared or reappeared. So, and I would continue that throughout the growing season, all the way into late fall. So, a little note on Inaturalist. Inaturalist is a project of the California Academy of Sciences and National Geographic. There's a website for it. There's also an app that you can put on your smartphone. It basically is using a database of images and artificial intelligence computer to identify things that you photograph. So if you take a close-up of the species you're interested, whether that be a fungus, a plant, a insect, a mammal, the app will often give you a suggestion of what that species is, and you can select that. Species. So here's one example. This was an observation that I made in August of 2020 of swamp milkweed, Asclepias incarnata. It is a milkweed species, a native milkweed species that is found in wetlands and wet areas. If you look at the bottom left, I suggest an ID of swamp milkweed. I have another member of the community also suggests that or confirms my observations. And eventually you get, if you see up at the top here, there's a little banner that says research grade. So the more people that agree with the original observation, it has a little more weight and status to that observation, because we all make mistakes. Some of us are just starting out, we're amateurs, some of us are professionals. So we're using sort of a crowdsourcing model to document and identify these species. And this has been used to actually identify brand new species in certain places, usually not in North America, but other places where biodiversity hotspots that have been maybe undersampled by the scientific community. And so now that we have these observations, we can start to see trends of this particular species. So you click on the species, we have swamp milkweed. The majority of the observations you can see from this graph occur in the summer that coincide with its bloom time, June, July, and August. And you can look at the map and see the distribution of the species. So you're going to have more observations in the core of its range and fewer at the periphery. But you can get a sense for how widespread the species is, or any species. So this is just an unbelievably helpful, useful tool for amateurs and scientists alike, and will help you with your plant identification skills. So the results of this survey, we'll go over that right now. The project duration went from mid-March to the beginning of November. It spanned 34 weeks, and I made observations every week except one. I did actually go on a vacation, and there was no way for me to squeeze this in. So I said, okay, we'll just have 1 week where it's missing, no problem. The total species observed were 154 plant species, and I don't believe I mentioned earlier the definition of forbs or wildflowers. This would exclude grasses and other graminoids or grass-like plants like sedges or rushes that don't have typically showy blooms. once again, they're getting to short shrift here. The grasses and sedges and such are a very critical part of our ecosystem. They have blooms, they do flower, they are often wind pollinated, but sometimes pollinated by insects, bees, ants, uh, other species. But for simplicity's sake, I just went with the forbs at this point. So 154 species of flowering forbs, about half and half in terms of being native versus non-native. And about 2/3 of those were wild versus 1/3 of them were cultivated, as you can see there. And these categories of native versus non-native don't coincide completely with wild versus cultivated because, as we know in northern Indiana, one of our best plant species, if you will, our favorite, is the blueberry. One of the blueberry species. There's a whole genus of different species, but this is a cultivated native species that we can find growing wild in the woods with kind of tiny small blueberries, and that species has been cultivated over time for use in agricultural production. So it is both native and cultivated. And this blueberry plant was one that I planted on the landscape. Okay, next, the typical blooming species, we had a median bloom period of 5 weeks. That means half the species had a bloom period of more than 5 weeks, and half of those species had a bloom period of less than 5 weeks. So a little over a month. The maximum occurrences that occurred for a species was the dandelion. It occurred on 28 of the 34 weeks I was able to find a blooming dandelion, and that's actually spanned from March 15th all the way to November 1st. So it spanned 34 weeks and it occurred 28 times. The minimum were several species that I could only find on one Sunday, such as the bloodroot species, which is a native spring ephemeral that bloomed, I believe, only for a span of 8 to 10 days. And of those 8 to 10 days on my property, only one Sunday was in there. So even though it was blooming for technically a little more than a week, it only occurred on one Sunday. The weekly maximum, I maximized the number of total blooming species in the middle of summer, in August, 55 total species. And this was fairly intuitive and not terribly surprising. The number of species rose from spring into summer and then declined from summer into fall, even as new characters would come into bloom and leave. So the maximum of new species was just into summer, and June 28th, there were 12 new species that started blooming. And the maximum week for the number of species that disappeared, also not surprising, was in late September, when 14 species that were blooming the week before were not found. And just like you're not supposed to pick a favorite child, you're not supposed to pick a favorite plant species, but I'm going to anyway because of this beauty called wood betony, or Pediculus canadensis. It is hemiparasitic, which means that it is partially parasitic. The roots tap some energy from neighboring grasses. It is a beautiful native species that blooms early, very characteristic of high quality oak savannas into prairies, and one of those species that is hard to cultivate and is expensive from a nursery perspective, but is definitely needed. And I think I sowed some of the seed out on my property when I first moved here and just got lucky. Sometimes it's really hard for it to germinate, it's hard to propagate, and I was just tickled pink to see several of these plants that just started growing and just have this absolutely gorgeous bloom. So looking at the growing season from left to right, from March to November, the total species is in blue with that little break from the week that I missed. And as you can see, it rises in the spring. There's kind of a lull in June, and then in July and August reaches its maximum, and then the total species declines as fall progresses. The red line is cumulative species, so every time I see a new species, this number goes up and stays up. And so it's basically a rising line, rising pretty steadily. I mean, I have a pretty steady increase in number of species. Every week I'm getting about 5 new species, all the way towards the end of the season. So some of the species, again, they're going to bloom in the spring for just a week or two. They may only bloom in the fall for several weeks, like your asters and goldenrods. And a lot of them will bloom in the middle of the growing season. So here's another way of looking at it. This is the number of new or disappeared species weekly. So let's just look at the blue line first. Again, this is the number of new plants that I had never seen blooming yet when I go out to observe. So May into June, I'm seeing about 5 to 10 species a week that are brand new to the property. And then over time that starts to go down, because even if a species is reappearing, it blooms earlier. I see dandelion again, it's not a new species. Well, actually, no, for this metric, my characterization of new is just anything that showed up again, I believe. Disappeared species is what it sounds like it was there the previous week and then not there the next week. So this kind of rose over time because towards the end, plants are going into senescence, or they're finishing their life cycle and they're not blooming anymore. So some limitations of this survey is that one, it became tiring and I can't find everything and I miss some species. Again, remember, this is a presence absence, so it's not counting the total number of blooms. If there is just one bloom out there, I need to find that every week, or I need to go back to that plant and kind of keep a map of my property in my head as best I could. And I missed at least 3 species that I knew of that I saw later that were in fruit, or I saw them vegetatively, but I didn't write them down because I didn't see them in flower. So they weren't listed because I didn't technically see them in flower or note when that was. And there were probably more species that I missed. And it was a nice exercise for me to learn a few more weedy species that I had never seen before, but had to do some looking up. Again, the limitation of this is that quantity is not captured. If I had a single tulip bulb that was resprouted from the previous landowner, I didn't plant any tulips, but this one keeps popping up, that counts. It counts the same as a profusion of dandelion blooms across my entire lawn. So I won't know in the future whether it was just 1 flower or 1,000, but that's just a limitation of the study. I don't have endless time to do this, and I'm not going to be out there counting every dandelion. A little bit of a diminishing returns on your investment of your time. And then lastly, it's not necessarily indicative of native or natural populations, right? Because our homesteads, our homes are a bit of an artifice. We are planting things, we're weeding things. Some of these species I saw in bloom and then immediately pulled because they were maybe an invasive species and I didn't want them on my property, so I only observed them once. So it's not really a true observation of how long their flowering period is. And there's some species that I brought in from other, latitudes, maybe some species I moved from my parents' house about 100 miles south. So, but this is not supposed to be the definitive, description of a single species. This is just adding to the reservoir of knowledge that we have, especially Inaturalist and their database making this possible. We can then see overall trends. If I'm making this observation here, 20 other people are making it in the same county, we can start to see some macro trends there. So that's all I have for you today. And I hope you enjoyed this bloom report, this project that I tried to take advantage of, this strange opportunity that we had with the coronavirus pandemic to always be prepared to expect the unexpected, to anticipate the absurd, or making lemonade out of lemons and all that. But I was really grateful that I had the time and the opportunity to do this, to collect the data and to share it in this way. I hope you enjoyed it. And if you have any questions, you can leave a comment below. I have the comments open, or you can email me. I'm sorry, I don't have my email up here, but if you Google Adam Thada, Center at Donaldson, you'll find my blog. I should be posting, I'll put my blog website in the comments here as well, or in the show description. And if you have any other questions or observations, please just let me know. I'd love to engage with you. So thank you for listening and taking the time to engage with this, and hope you have a good day.